Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to explore a powerful turning point in the story of Toan and Tu Diem, a moment when Toan must leave the woman who saved his life, step into an uncertain future, and hold on to hope while his past remains a mystery. As Tu Diem promises to wait for him, their bond is tested by fear, gratitude, and a future neither of them can see clearly yet. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Early morning light slipped through the narrow gaps of the thatched roof. It wasn't harsh, it spread across the dirt floor, the fire, and rested on the grandmother's face as she sat quietly beside it. She sat slightly hunched, her hands resting on her knees, fingers rough from years of work. The fire burned low and steady, just enough to warm the simple hut. The space was quiet, broken only by the crackle of wood and the wind moving through thin bamboo walls. Toan stood in front of her. He stood straight, but his shoulders sagged slightly. Hesitation showed clearly on his face. He didn't know where to start, so he spoke directly. His voice was low. He spoke slowly, choosing each word. "Grandma, I don't want to leave you." He paused and looked down at the dirt floor. "You saved my life. I don't remember who I am. I don't remember where I came from. But I know one thing. You're the one who brought me back." He looked up. "Now you're here alone. You're old. You're in debt. You have to work far from home. I can't feel at ease." He took a deep breath. "I want to stay. I want to work with you. I want to help you. I want to repay you." The grandmother looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were steady. No pity, no blame. They were the eyes of someone who had lived through loss. She didn't answer right away. She pushed a piece of wood deeper into the fire. The flame flared briefly, then settled. "I understand," she said. Her voice was calm and firm. "But I'm old now. This place is only temporary. Today we're here. Tomorrow we may have to go somewhere else. My life isn't stable. You can't tie your future to that." She looked at him. "Tu Diem cares about you. She wants you to live with her. Staying close will help your memory return faster. The doctor said so too. You need to focus on recovery." Toan clenched his hands, his throat tightened. "But if I go, you'll be alone." She placed her hand on his shoulder, thin, rough, but steady. "I'm used to it. I've lived alone for many years. Don't trade your future for me." She looked straight into his eyes. "Go. When you remember everything, come back. Just don't forget me." The air in the hut grew heavy. Toan nodded slowly. A tear fell onto the dirt floor. He didn't wipe it away. The grandmother turned her face slightly, pretending to look at the fire. Outside, the morning wind grew stronger. Cold air crept inside. The hut shook lightly. Footsteps sounded at the door. The grandmother looked up immediately, worry clear in her eyes. "Is that you, Diem?" she asked. "I heard you had an accident last night. Are you okay?" Tu Diem stepped inside and bowed. She moved closer to the fire. Fatigue lingered on her face, but her eyes were clear. "I'm fine, Grandma." The grandmother wasn't reassured yet. She watched her carefully. "I was worried all night. Tell me clearly." Tu Diem nodded and spoke slowly. "Someone tried to snatch my bag last night. I chased him and fell. Luckily, people nearby helped. The thief was caught and taken to the police. I only had minor scrapes." The grandmother let out a long breath. Her shoulders relaxed. "That's a relief. It's dangerous out there these days." Toan stood still, watching her. Worry rose sharply in his chest. Even without memories, the fear of losing her was real. Tu Diem looked at him and smiled lightly. I'm okay. The grandmother pulled another chair closer. Sit down. It's still cold. The three sat around the small fire. No one rushed to speak. The flame burned steadily. The silence was heavy. Tu Diem spoke first, her voice soft but firm. Grandma, I came today to pick up Aunt Toan. I want him to live with me. I'll take care of him. I believe this will help his memory return sooner. The grandmother looked at her, then at Toan. I've already talked to him. He should go with you. Toan looked at the fire and took a deep breath. Yes, I've agreed. The grandmother nodded. Sadness remained in her eyes, but she didn't stop them. I won't hold you back. Staying close will help Toan recover. Tu Diem held Toan's hand. Her grip was warm and firm. Thank you, Grandma. Toan looked at her. I'll visit you often. She smiled. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. The grandmother stayed silent for a moment longer. She reached out and adjusted the piece of wood in the fire, as if trying to slow time down. She knew that once the flame burned lower, this conversation would come to an end. She looked at Toan, her eyes lingering on his face, as if trying to memorize every detail. When you're there, she said slowly, take care of yourself. Don't do heavy work. If you feel tired, say it. Don't force yourself. Toan nodded immediately. Yes, Grandma. She then turned to Tu Diem. You too, take care of him for me. He doesn't remember anything, but he's not weak. He just hasn't gotten used to himself yet. Tu Diem nodded, her voice steady and without hesitation. I understand. I'll watch over him carefully. The grandmother let out a soft breath, as if releasing part of her worry. She looked back at the fire, then toward the doorway. The morning light had grown brighter. A new day had begun. But for her, it also meant accepting another quiet emptiness. Toan followed her gaze. He understood that from this moment on, leaving was unavoidable. He didn't say anything more, but inside he made himself a promise. Whether his memory returned or not, he would come back. Morning sunlight streamed through the doorway, covering the three figures sitting together. They weren't family by blood, but they were bound by real affection. The small fire kept burning, trying to warm hearts that were about to part. The air inside the thatched hut was still heavy. The fire burned steadily, but no one spoke. The grandmother sat quietly. Tu Diem remained silent as well. Toan could clearly feel the weight lingering in the room. He knew that if they stayed like this any longer, the emotions would only grow harder to control. Toan stood up first. He turned toward the grandmother, his voice low but firm. Grandma, he said, may I go out to the fields with Diem for a while? It might help clear my head. The grandmother looked up at him. She understood immediately. She didn't ask anything else. She simply nodded. Yes, go outside for a bit. Sitting in here too long makes the heart feel heavy. Tu Diem stood up as well. She picked up the bamboo basket resting near the door. Toan bowed slightly to the grandmother once more, then stepped outside. The door closed behind them. The space beyond opened wide and bright. The morning wind brushed past them, carrying the scent of damp soil and lingering dew from the fields. Toan took a deep breath. His shoulders loosened. His chest felt lighter. He realized that simply stepping out of the hut had already changed something inside him. Tu Diem walked beside him. She didn't speak right away. She kept her pace slow so Toan wouldn't have to strain to follow. The dirt path leading to the fields was familiar, marked by footprints and old wheel tracks. The sun had risen higher now. Light slanted across the rows of crops. The fields stretched quietly ahead, calm and orderly. When they reached the green bean patch, Tu Diem set the basket down first. She bent slightly and parted the leaves to check the pods. "Only pick the big ones," she said. "Leave the smaller ones for later." Toan nodded. He followed her instructions carefully. His fingers brushed against each bean. The cool moisture from the remaining dew made him pause for a brief moment. The sensation felt familiar, yet there was no memory attached to it. They worked side by side. There was no need to talk much, only the soft rustling of leaves and the gentle sound of beans dropping into the basket. Their movements settled into a slow, steady rhythm. From time to time, Tu Diem glanced at Toan. She watched how he bent down, how he straightened up. She wanted to be sure he wasn't pushing himself, even if he didn't say anything. "Are you used to doing this kind of work?" Toan asked, breaking the silence. "Not exactly," Tu Diem replied. "But living here, if you don't work, there's nothing to eat. Everything has to be done by hand." Toan nodded. He looked across the wide field in front of them. A strange feeling stirred inside him. It wasn't a memory. It was more like a quiet familiarity, as if his body remembered a life his mind could not reach. When the basket was nearly full, they stopped. Sweat dotted their foreheads. Tu Diem took out a towel and handed it to Toan. "Wipe your face," she said. "The morning wind is cold. It's easy to get tired." Toan took the towel and wiped his face. His hand paused for a moment. "Do you really think I'll remember?" he asked. Tu Diem didn't answer right away. She rearranged the beans in the basket, making sure they were neat. "The doctor said memory can return when you're in a safe environment," she said, "especially when you're close to people you know." Toan looked at her. "And you?" he asked. Tu Diem lifted her gaze. Her eyes were steady, without hesitation. "I believe you will." Just 2 words, but they were firm enough that Toan didn't ask anything else. They continued on to the seed stall, a small stand set up along the road. Bags of seeds were neatly stacked. The seller was someone Tu Diem knew well. She asked carefully about yield, harvest time, and how the rice handled dry weather. She listened closely. Then she chose a variety that was easy to grow and produced a good yield. "This one suits the soil here," the seller said. "We'll take this one," Tu Diem replied. Toan stood beside her. He didn't interrupt. He simply observed. The way she made decisions was clear and steady. No hesitation, no uncertainty. On the way back, the basket felt heavier. The sun climbed higher. The light grew stronger. But Toan's steps were more even than they had been earlier that morning. Along the path, Tu Diem began to talk more. She talked about the dishes she would cook with Grandma. Simple meals, vegetable soup, stir-fried beans. She talked about making extra portions for Toan so he wouldn't go hungry. She spoke about evenings when the 3 of them would sit by the fire together. About days that were busy but unhurried. About hopes for the future, not distant or grand, just enough to keep moving forward one day at a time. Toan listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. Each word she spoke felt like a seed being planted inside him. Small but real. They stopped by the edge of a field. The wind picked up, moving through the crops. The plants swayed gently. Tu Diem set the basket down. She turned toward Toan and took his hand. "Even if you don't remember who you are yet," she said slowly, "I'll still wait. I believe that one day you'll remember everything." Toan tightened his grip around her hand. Inside him, emotions tangled together. Gratitude, hope, and a vague fear of a past that had not yet returned. But at that moment, he didn't let go. They stood quietly in the middle of the field. The wind passed through. Life continued as usual around them. But for Toan, that moment was enough to keep moving forward.
Tập phim tiếp nối bằng khoảnh khắc Toàn xin phép bà cụ ra cuộc cùng Từ Diễm để xua đi bầu không khí nặng nề. Ngoài cánh đồng buổi sáng, họ cùng hái đậu, làm việc chậm rãi để Toàn dần cảm thấy nhẹ lòng và an toàn. Những hành động quen thuộc gợi lên cảm giác gần gũi dù ký ức chưa trở lại. Trên đường mua giống lúa, Toàn quan sát sự bình tĩnh, quyết đoán của Từ Diễm và thêm tin tưởng và lựa chọn ở bên cô. Dọc đường về, Từ Diễm kể về những bữa cơm giản dị, về những buổi tối ngồi bên bếp lửa cùng bà và về hy vọng cho tương lai bình thường phía trước. Cao trào đến khi Từ Diễm nắm tay Toàn, hứa đợi anh trong tương lai.